What do AOL Search Revolution and Xfinity's personalized TV browsing have in common? One brilliant tech mind behind who's joining us today. Welcome to Software Without Borders, where we explore the edges of innovation in the software industry. I'm Jarret Striner, joined by my co-host, Andy Hilliard, CEO of Accelerance. Today, we're thrilled to have Larry Cynkin, a seasoned entrepreneur who has held CTO and VP Engineering roles at 5 startups across various sectors, including healthcare, e-commerce, and edtech. Larry's impressive journey includes spearheading search applications at AOL and developing personalized TV browsing at Comcast Labs. So whether you're an emerging entrepreneur or an established executive, today's insights are for you. So make sure to subscribe and leave a review if you enjoy our discussions. Let's welcome Larry Cynkin to the show. Well, Larry, thank you for joining us here at Software Without Borders. When reviewing your background, one thing that stuck out to me was AOL Search. And search has gone a very, very long way since the evolution of that. But why don't you tell us how that came about at AOL, why they decided to add search, and what that meant to be at the beginning of a real revolution that changed the way the internet was
Well,
used?
so it might be helpful for me to talk about how I got into AOL working on search. I actually had been the director of application development at a startup doing full text search. This was back in the 90s. It was called Personal Library Software. And we started pre-web and were on the vanguard of the web and full text search on the web prior to players like Google entering the market. One of our clients or customers was AOL, and they used our technology for doing search in their garden. And they ultimately acquired us. It was really, I think, an acqui-hire to bring in our knowledge of search and navigation into AOL and help them uh, extend it and also be able to control their fate, since it was a foundational technology. I think at that time, these were the early days of online and web-based systems, but it was clear that content discovery was critical. So in AOL, I didn't invent it, but I did inherit and manage AOL keywords, which was a big thing back in the day, and directory search and other forms of content discovery in the system.
It's really interesting because you look at the growth, right? You're in one company, another company is like, oh, wait a second, we really like what you guys are doing. Through the evolution of the things you're doing, have you seen that happen multiple times where you're working on a particular project and you see, a larger company come by and say, I really like what you're doing here. It's either, can you build this for us or can we acquire you?
Well, it happened another time in a similar circumstance, but not with an acquirer that ended up becoming famous like AOL. So several years later, um, I was working for a live question and answer startup called Wonder with an I. And uh, this was maybe the early aughts. Um, Steve Case had moved on from AOL and had started something called Revolution Health Group. And this was an attempt to compete with WebMD as a health portal. And in forming that company, they acquired 3 startups, one of which was Wonder. And what we brought was a combination of search, content discovery, as well as at that point community, because we had been doing live questions and answers. And so, uh, in a similar way, I ended up building anew uh, a few different components of that portal, including the content discovery, the social community um, communication, as well as consumer-based applications.
Now, looking at that change for you in your career, when you switch from something like I built this, then I move here, were there lessons along the way that you saw that, okay, well, I'm building these things and then there's an acquirement here? Or do you feel like I'm just going to keep going down this path and see where it takes me.
So I certainly was going down the path to see where it takes me, um, learning lessons along the way. Um, I mean, for me personally, I didn't identify search as this is what I want to do early in my career. Like a lot of people, I fell into it. That was what an opportunity that I got into and thrived in for a while. And I think it was a great area to be in because it is foundational to a lot of different systems, and it continues to be. Um, but I think maybe the most important lessons weren't specific to that domain, but rather software development, building teams, delivering production quality software. To me, that is what has carried me throughout the rest of my career. And, you can learn those anywhere. And I had, I've mentioned going back and forth between startups and a larger company and back to a startup. And to me, that's been really valuable experience to uh, practice best practices in different environments at different scales and understanding what's common and what has to be adjusted depending on the environment.
Oh, Larry, hey, before we get into the learnings and the evolution of creating teams and the changes in the different development environments that you've been in, maybe you can walk us through, over the last 30 years, you mentioned large companies and small companies and different types of team makeup.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little flavor over the last 30, 35 years, sort of what types of teams, what sizes of teams, how the teams were organized, where they were located, all that?
Well, and if you go back 30 years, regrettably, that is not the beginning, but it's getting there. Uh, I've worked in three people teams, um, managed 30 people, dozens of people, and been in large organizations like at Comcast that I'm wasn't managing the whole organization, but interacted and operated within hundreds of people. Um, some of this, it's probably been a pretty even split for me between having in-house full-time employees and outsourced workers of various kinds. And I was just thinking about all the different countries where people that I have worked with and managed have been located. And, for instance, currently, like today, I'm working with one team that has a Ukraine base with people kind of scattered around that area. And I'm also working on another project with a couple of Egyptian developers. And
Hmm.
there's, Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America. That's probably been half of uh, the teams that I've worked with and managed. And uh, Obviously, it's accelerated in the last several years as remote work has become more common and more readily supported by all the tech, like what we're using today, to make it easy to communicate.
So, Larry, can you also talk about how these teams were formed in the different, you mentioned full-time employees,
Yeah,
maybe you worked with captives of an organization, maybe you worked with individual contractors, maybe you worked with outsourced partners, maybe all of the above. Can you kind of describe the
sure.
different blend of team makeup?
Uh, I've certainly hired people directly. I have hired people through contractors where the contract employees were almost indistinguishable from a full-time employee. You wouldn't know who was who if you walked in the door. I've hired uh, teams through contracting companies where basically they're supplying their people,
Mm.
and we were more engaging with the firm that was providing those people,
Hmm.
everything in between.
Can you also talk about maybe some functional and dysfunctional models that you've come across to where it is difficult to sort of organize and get teams on the same page and get them working collaboratively together?
Well,
And
yeah,
that doesn't necessarily mean, culturally or even locationally. It obviously could mean leadership and management and organization, right?
first of all, I think, you have to look at the motivation of the people on the team, in any team,
Hmm.
no matter how they arrived. And um, I think to some extent, people with the right motivation, meaning they're interested in, they have a growth mindset, they are in this field because they like doing it, not because it was a necessity or their only avenue to make a living. There's nothing wrong with making a living, but hopefully it's a combination of that. And you like doing software. There's no substitute for that. And that's global to me. That's, you find people everywhere that are like that. And there are people that may not have the right motivation. When I'm in my role, since I'm in a CTO role, I'm currently, as basically an advising consulting CTO. When I'm helping a on a project to perhaps engage an outsourced development firm, I still want to talk to at least the leads on the team that would be working on the project, in order to map them into my understanding of engineers and what their motivations are, as well as their understanding of the technology and how they solve problems and how they think about how to build software. I
Mm.
think there's certainly some universal concepts for good software development, and they're truly universal across any environment, any origin, and any project.
Okay. So let's take the example of you're coming into a new project and you need to build a team and I think maybe you've made a decision to leverage offshore development. How do you go about constructing the team? How do you go about forming the team? How do you go about building team culture?
Yeah. So the the first question is, what's the project and what's the roadmap for the project? I want to probe that as much as possible initially to understand uh, what kinds of resources we might need on the project. Um, I like to first uh, come up with a concept of, I would call it's, in engineering, you talk about a logical diagram versus a physical diagram. Well, I'd like to come up with a logical diagram of a team. I may not even, I might not have titles, but maybe I know I need certain functions or um, expertise represented on this team in order to execute on a roadmap. Then that helps direct me towards, number one, the right firms that maybe have done that kind of thing before. So they're not learning, on our dime. And also have an informed discussion with the firm about the kinds of expertise that we're interested in seeing. Do they have that? What kinds of people do they have that can bring that expertise?
When you talk about remote teams, one thing we notice is communication is a very big proponent of that, right? How do you communicate what route, and with email and Slack and Zoom, do you feel that sometimes, you really need to be there in person to get your point across, or do you find that communication tools there you might lose something in translation, or what has worked well for you, or where have you seen they're using one particular type might have been an issue?
Well, you know, I'm going to use first, let me just start with the word agile, lowercase a. You got to be agile in how you approach whether you can get together in person. Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. Um, it's ideal if you can establish a relationship in person initially, get on the same page, and also during project initiation, often the kinds of things you're discussing benefit from being in the same room, being able to whiteboard, being able to have a lot of a rapid feedback cycle on a discussion. If you were trying to define what it is you're going to do as opposed to getting more into an execution mode of doing it. So it's ideal if you can have everybody together, in my opinion. Can't always, but it's preferable. Assuming you've established those relationships and you've also established some of the definition of the work that you're trying to do, we have great tools. It's amazing to be in meetings where people are all over the world, and you're all occupying your square, and you're on the on the screen. You can share your Agile board. You can look at things together. You can demo things online. And also you can use various forms of communication in real-time, asynchronous and synchronous communication, with either chat or email or however you do it. So that all of those go a long way. I think to start off with and supplement with some in person is ideal. If you can, I recommend it. I'm on projects where it's not possible. I've never met the Egyptian developers that I work with. I'd love to. I don't, but we are certainly productive.
Larry, how do you manage up and set expectations along the way when you're working with a distributed team, and there are some stakeholders that are wholly focused on budget, on time, and then of course you have maybe product management that they're focused more on the customer and the deliverable of workable software, and customer needs, and they're they don't sit in your seat, and they have certain aspects of how it should be done. Obviously, they're not practitioners like yourself. So, how do you continue to set expectations with
That's a great
stakeholders?
question, Annie, because if expectations are not aligned from the beginning, you're screwed. It's so important to do that. I would say one of my secret weapons is agile thinking.
Mm,
Right from the beginning, to the extent that I can, if they're not already used to doing things in an agile way, get stakeholders to buy into the idea that we are going to demonstrate things progressively as they're being done. And they only have to kind of suspend, their just suspicions for a short period of time till the first V.1, version 0.1 emerges and they can see what's
mm,
happening. To me, I think in most cases, in my experience, stakeholders are very excited to see something real happening because they know that it's not just going to be, the problem with traditional waterfall projects is you don't know if anything's happening until near the end. If they see something
sure.
pretty fast, it's on the right path. They have a chance to give feedback, and that's very important. That also is setting their expectations about the pace because they can see how long it took to get to that increment and how long
Mm,
it takes to get to the next increment. There's progress. They can they get a reality check on their own expectations of what the pace is. So if we can all agree as a team, if I'm a technical leader on the team, I'm working with non-technical leaders and their stakeholders to let's do this progressively in an iterative way, then I'm well on the way to realistic expectation setting and adjustment that will lead to a successful outcome.
mm. Okay. I was reading one of your articles about And I paraphrase this because I don't have the exact language, but when software is delivered, hardly anyone is perfectly happy or something like that. Everyone has slightly different expectations depending on their roles and depending on their motivations and probably what else is going on in life depends on just where they're at. Is there any other tips or tricks on as far as mitigating those expectations? And now you had mentioned obviously keeping them in the loop and showing them pieces along the way. Anything else you can talk about?
Well, you can refer to other similar projects, and if you have information about how long they took,
Yeah.
or what was involved, or how many people. I mean, a lot of times, especially if you're working with small to medium-sized teams,
Mm.
you can often find an example that's well known of something that's in the space that somebody built, and they had hundreds of engineers on it.
Mm.
And you can point to that and say, the application that you love to talk about, well, that was like, this many engineering years of work that has gone into that. Or if it's just a mature product, and you can talk about, look, you can't set your expectation by the thing that's been out there for 8 years that has that much work that's gone into it. We're starting from scratch. So that's something that I've used before. I Yeah, to some degree, I think it also just comes down to projecting credibility and not BSing people. So,
Sure.
if you do that in general, then when you're talking about schedule and expectations, you have a better chance of being believed.
Sure.
And I think
Absolutely.
there's some intangibles there that I don't, I think some of this is
That's
just experience.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I was thinking about this concept of being vulnerable and being open and being inclusive of other stakeholders, so that they sort of buy in, they lean into the sort of the collaborative process across different functions and across different roles within the organizations and outside of the development ecosystem as a whole. Um, let me ask you a question about, in your own experience, do you have a preferred, when you're dealing with an offshore service provider and development, do you have a preferred criteria or expectation around the offshore providers role, their expertise, or are you more looking for just talent and bodies because you have your own uh,
And
methodology and you have your own
yeah, Andy,
structure?
it depends on the project. There are projects where there's a necessary expertise. For instance, I've been working on a project that involves transcription. They're not inventing transcription, but they need to use transcription, and there are some shops that may not be that familiar with integrating. It's basically an AI service into
Mm.
an application. So it was important to find a firm that had some experience with that. In general, what I think about is every firm that's out there is competing with other firms for the talent, to get the best talent in their talent pool. And one of the things that's always a component of my vetting of an outsourced firm is, how do you attract talent and retain them? How are you competing against the other companies that are also trying to hire those engineers and keep them around?
Mm.
So, and you can tell a lot, I think, from the answer to that question. And that
Mm.
is, I think, helpful because it is pretty much technology agnostic, and it applies to any project. If they're having to take the cast off some other companies because they're not giving them growth opportunities, or another question of that there is, well, what's the tenure of the people what's your average tenure? What's the tenure of the people that are on the team working on this? Did you hire them in last week? It happens sometimes
Sure.
Sometimes it's, they don't have people on the bench. They got to find somebody that's going to, but do you have some people that have been around for a while, and how does that, or nobody that's been around for a while?
You speak of AI and putting AI into product. Have you seen more of a rush for people to hit on AI as it is the new kid on the block? Is everyone trying to put it into a product, whether it belongs there or not? And has that taken more of a engineering wide view? Right now, I need more engineers. I don't have enough people on my staff to handle putting AI into a product. Are you seeing that it is becoming a larger scope, across the globe of finding engineers to help, dig into this new the new thing, like said at AOL, this was a pre-existing piece that got brought in. Now, you know, everyone's looking to enhance what they currently have with AI. Do you see this becoming either we don't have enough people to build it, or is this something where we just need to find the people to add to the project?
Here's what I would say about AI and teams and software development. What's going on with AI and generative AI is the democratization of AI. And that was going on before generative AI. And that's what's really important, which means you don't usually need special people. You might need people that know how to integrate. As I mentioned, the transcription project, they're not inventing transcription. That is a very specialized thing. You need specialized people for that. When I was at Comcast and we were doing personalized TV navigation for Xfinity, uh, I was working with a team of researchers, PhDs in building recommendation systems. We built a proprietary system that backed that, but that was 10 plus years ago. And these days, you don't need that unless you're working in that company. And as an application developer, and most in most contexts, and the ones I typically work in, you want to just use best of breed that's out there because it's becoming um, API interfaces that you integrate into your application. So no, I don't think you need special people. For a client that I've been working with, one of the things we did is we actually built in that transcription project, we built an application whose purpose was to help us compare the performance of transcription platforms. So we could pick the best one, and the best one, the other thing about this, Jarret, is it is changing rapidly.
Yeah, I
So
mean, I
it,
my mom actually used to do medical transcription many, many years ago, and she would sit with headphones and a tape, and she would type. That was the transcription. So knowing that there are services, I actually use one with it's not necessarily transcription, but it takes video and it'll give me the closed captioning, right? So I
sure,
don't have to sit there and listen to it and type it
that
out.
is
So
transcription. It's
you know, it
transcribing the
yeah,
audio of the recording.
yeah. So to me, it's just when we continue to see the evolution from you know, I remember using that Comcast system, by the way. So okay, what am I going to watch tonight? Do. And then you look at it as like, okay, this is functional. How do I, and you think about when you use things, right? The usability testing of it all to make it functional for everyone that's using it. Even now it's like, remote. I'm like, they do voice now because people don't want to have to click through everything. You can talk to your remote and tell it what you want to watch.
Yeah. So, Jarret, I think a point that's worth mentioning with regard to looking for talent and qualifying talent is what we were just talking about, which is things are changing pretty fast.
Mm.
So I'm looking for people usually that are not living in a proverbial cave, that have not been working on one thing for 20 years and have never seen anything else, unless that's exactly what we need. So it's important, I think, and usually, I think again, it's a global thing. Good engineers like to learn things, and you don't have to ask them; they will be looking at new things. Usually, the issue as a manager is you don't want them to too quickly move to the bright shiny object that's the new tech. But I think if there's a happy medium of they're paying attention to what's going on out there, and they're aware of all of the different platform services, tools, libraries that are available and that are emerging, that might be useful to make this project successful.
How should a CTO think today in regards to um, the expectations of productivity within his development workforce, and whether or not to even consider outsourcing, offshoring, which has its own set of complexities and variables, versus maybe thinking a leaner domestic workforce, which removes some of those offshore variables, and then setting expectations around, which of course is hard because things are evolving so quickly, around what sort of productivity advances AI can bring them that way. I guess one way of thinking about it is, I got an email the other day saying, we're actually thinking about pulling back from offshore and maybe getting leaner domestically, and also setting KPIs for productivity over time, leveraging AI. I'm like, okay. I mean, what's
Well,
your thought
I
about that?
think some projects might go through cycles, and there might be a phase where they feel like uh, or they want to focus on the domestic team.
Mhm.
I think usually if um, the phase of the project. Uh, let me think about how to say this. Um, you get higher bandwidth communication. This is a broad generalization, but the highest
Sure.
bandwidth communication is people within one culture, one language, ideally one time zone, and ideally in physically in the same place. You can't beat that. And everything that you change in those attributes is going to um, do something to diminish the collaboration and the communication.
Sure.
So, why would you ever outsource? Why did this ever happen? Why did this turn into an industry? Well, a bunch of reasons. One, you can't find the people domestically. I mean, the global workforce is so much larger than whatever you have in your area or even in the United States. Number one, obviously there's cost benefits. Given if you were US based or Western based, you are in a higher cost of living area and a higher cost of
Sure.
labor area compared to other areas. Um, Also, um, and I have this discussion pretty often. We're looking to hire. We know we need a person to help us do X. I look at, is that a full-time role for a long period of time? What's
Mm,
the backlog of work for that person? Is it something that kind
sure.
of just stretches off into the future kind of indefinitely? Or is there a bunch of stuff we know we need to do? But after that, it's not clear.
Sure.
Because if you're not sure it's really stretching off into the future, a lot of times that is a good reason, whether it is doing the whole thing, outsourced, or maybe augmenting with outsourced people, your team,
Sure.
to uh, take on, to flex, right, your productivity and your capacity for work with this other team for a while, and um, basically use the elasticity of the outsourcing model to match what you need in terms of productivity for a period of time. It's easier to pull it back. It's demoralizing
Mm,
if you have full-time employees and you just don't have work for them to do. Um, that even if you keep them, even if you don't lay them off or terminate them, you're going to have uh, demotivated engineers if they don't have enough to do because they were brought in to address a temporary glut of things to do. So you got to look at this project. What are the needs of the project, and how long does it go out in the future? That, and then there's a whole other situation. And Andy, this is the situation you're talking about. Sounds like they have their own technical management, so they can handle in-house people. But certainly for any company that doesn't have in place the technical management that's part of their team and their process and their own culture to manage this work, it's almost essential to go outsource if you want to get something done anytime soon. So I'm throwing another variable in there in terms of describing when you would choose to outsource the work versus do it in-house.
Yeah, that was very insightful and practical. I appreciate that. Jarret, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's interesting because you look at I guess one thing that I've heard about, especially with outsourcing, is sometimes the capabilities of the people you have currently on staff are not there for the project you want to build. Would, augmenting your staff with outsourcing for that variability, would that be something that people should be looking at
It
as well?
might. I would say if I'm a manager with in-house people, the first thing I want to do is give them opportunities, growth opportunities, and um, if they can learn, I would look to that. But sometimes what you need is pretty specific or arcane. They're not going to learn it, or you don't have the time for them to learn it. And you might find somebody outside who can do it. Or there might be a specialty, and I'm thinking about things like maybe UX or DevOps or something that isn't really represented on your team or not sufficiently, and you want some of that. But again, it's not something that maybe you need all of a sudden to build this expensive, high-powered, permanent function within your organization. You want a piece of it that somebody else can give you. Then it might be worth outsourcing that. Again, you're trying to match the resourcing to the need that you have, and some needs fit in-house people better, and some needs fit outsourced people better.
Does it matter company size? Since you said you've gone from Comcast and AOL to startups, do you see the differentiation between the size of the company and how much outsourcing
Well,
is
I think
necessary?
smaller organizations might tend more towards outsourcing because typically they'll be less mature. They don't have, again, the management in place, and um, it's proportionally a bigger flex to ramp up a project versus a larger company that might have more maturity internally in terms of their management process. And for them, it might be more a matter of simply managing the resources that they're applying to the work against the expected scope and duration of the work. And if it's not, even a large company may not want to build up an organization to do software development where they really think they need to go in heavy on innovating on something now or building something new. But once you build it, you're still going to need to enhance and maintain, but that's a different phase, and it's probably going to require fewer resources. Maybe I'm a naive technologist, but I'd like to think you're not going to hire people that you don't plan to keep around. Maybe it's better to augment with outsourced resources that can take this on for you. And keeping in mind, an outsourced firm, that's what they do. So they're used to everybody's expectation in the outsourced firm is they're going to do project by project with clients like you, as opposed to, I don't know, moving my family to be in the location of the company, if that's still, that still happens sometimes, not always, or simply orienting my life around your company and so forth. So there's not a one
Uh,
size fits all answer to any of these questions.
No,
No.
that's absolutely for sure. And I'm gonna ask you a not one size fits all question to follow up with that. And that is, one of the things I remember you mentioning to me is don't define the solution before you finish defining the problem. And that sounds like a pretty, I mean, it sounds logical, but when you're working with a team, how do you define that? What does that mean to the team? How do you get on the same page? When is the definition of the problem finished adequately, and how do you get the team to be understanding what you mean by that?
So I want to take this in two different ways. I want to talk first about the non-technical stakeholders.
Thank you.
They might not know exactly what the definition is. And to them, I would say, well, maybe what you need is a development partner who can iterate with you to help you figure it out, which is one of the strengths of Agile process, that you're iterating and you're learning from what you're building and course correcting. Maybe that's a good approach. For engineers, specifically engineers, where I sometimes will see, problem solving, running off with problem solving on the kernel of a problem that isn't well understood or fully defined. And that can lead to all kinds of problems of over engineering solution, just simply solving for the wrong thing, building something custom that could have been off the shelf if you had just looked, or omitting some capability that was really important because you hadn't talked about it enough to know that that was something you had to keep in mind. So engineers definitely should be, unless there's a specific intentional effort to say do some R&D and you're trying to figure out something that you're not sure of. If you're actually working on something that is where the solution is knowable, make sure the problem is well understood and defined with your team, your product ownership or management, before you define the solution.
And how do you know when it's fully defined or adequately defined, and when you can start formulating a solution?
So, I mean, I'm tempted to just be glib and just say, if you can estimate it, like engineers, if they don't have any more questions, then probably it's defined well enough. So again, I think, well, who are you asking this question on behalf of? For the product manager who's defining it, maybe one way to tell. I think there's more than one answer to this, and I think if you ask me tomorrow, I could probably think of some more things. But one way to answer it is, if everything that you could describe to test whether this was done, what are the directions for testing this to ensure that it was completed? If that's well defined, and you feel comfortable that you could hand this off to somebody, and if they just said, yes, all of this works the way you just described, or I can test it and all that's true, you're confident that you're going to get back what you need, then there's a good chance that you defined it well enough. On the engineering side, boy, part of that's just a matter of experience of,
Sure.
it's partly why you want, on any given team, you need to look at the level of experience of the different engineers, because they might recognize that and that's part of good estimating, by the way, is it's comparative, right? Like, this work is like that work that we've already done or that I've done before, and that I know how big that was, so I can point this work. Similarly, I might have done something similar, so I might know, there are some edge cases here that you haven't talked about. I need to ask you about them, because I know they're going to come up, or they could come up, and we need to discuss them before we move forward. That's a matter of experience.
At some point, you need to move forward, and I know problem definition doesn't stop when development commences. It continues on throughout the entire process, right? Because people come up with things, and people change their
Sure.
mind, and people redefine the target
Well,
audience, and
it's
all
a
sorts
whole
of
other
things,
discussion on good agile process there, right? And I don't think we're going to get into
Yeah.
that. But in short, what you want to do, so, you know, at the beginning, you want to make sure the work is well defined. It's quote ready. The definition of ready of being nobody has any questions. It's estimatable.
Yeah.
And also we know how to do it. That's a kind of maybe a important technical aspect of the process of
Sure.
the product manager has defined it well, and and everything is there that would allow me to estimate it, but I don't actually understand how we're going to do it well enough to estimate it. So being able to estimate it's key. On the other side, deliver the version of the feature or whatever it is that was described. And I would say be disciplined and ruthless about that. If somebody sees it and says, wait a minute, we need this. Can you do this? Unless you're in a hyper agile, maybe a Kanban environment, deliver it and get into the discipline of saying, okay, write another ticket that describes what you want to change in this, and we'll take that. Otherwise, you start to bleed into never-ending work that's never delivered.
For sure. Yeah, makes sense.
Definitely. Well, besides the definition of ready, there's also the definition of done,
That's
which I think we have gotten to today in our episode. Larry, I want to thank you for your time today. I know that I learned a lot, and so did Andy, and hopefully we can bring you back on the show and we can get into a little bit more of that agile workplace as we discussed.
Sure.
It's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate your having me on the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Larry.
And for all of our listeners, make sure you subscribe and like us. And for my co-host Andy Hilliard, I'm Jarret Striner. And remember, at Software Without Borders, innovation knows no limits.